Good morning. Welcome to the service webinar for this month. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names in the chat, and we're excited to look ahead at the new year with you in today's topic. Before we begin, I do want to highlight the chat, which you can use to ask questions throughout the meeting. As always, we have several team members who will answer questions as you ask them and then pass along questions that are relevant for the entire group for a Q&A session we'll have at the end. If you do have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you afterward. And with that, let's get into it. So the plan for today is to cover our recommendations for refreshing your database as you prepare for the new year. It's an excellent topic for the end of the year as we can look into your system. We'll go through a lot of different tips and tricks to help you keep your database in top shape. So to start off, we'll look at your volunteer application and volunteer profile information, effectively what data you're collecting and kind of how that's formatted. And then we'll move into some general database cleanup. So for the volunteer side of the system, groups, as well as opportunities. And then finally, we'll discuss some options for visually updating your console to match your website better. So the end of the year is a good time to make changes to the information on your volunteer application. And that can include adding questions or removing information, changing the wording, or even just reordering, and also updating your terms and conditions. Pretty much all of that is found in the system configuration. Now, I want to point out from the admin perspective, when you're logged in, you can kind of get an idea of what your application looks like by using the Add New Volunteer button under Volunteer Management. But this is the administrative perspective view of this page. The volunteer application page is slightly different in that there are other required fields. So to get an accurate view of that, you would need to navigate to your volunteer application directly. Now, in the system configuration, under the system management heading, there are two sections that pertain to your application. One of those is information collection, which essentially houses all of the default questions that service contains, things like address, alternate phone number, gender, birth date, things like that. Pretty standard things that you can toggle on and off, and also add some changes to, like changing what selection options are available for a couple of these items. So these are pretty standard questions that you can update in terms of what data you're collecting, whether or not it's a part of the application. Also in this section, you'll find the different options for your attributes. So if you want to enable or disable any of the attributes, you can do that through here. Where you're most likely going to be revising questions or adding in more specific information is through your custom fields, which is found below this section in custom volunteer profile fields. In this section, you can create several different types of custom questions. And of course, you can also edit those or navigate through different methods of using these fields. There's 3 different types, like I mentioned, but kind of the general idea is the first 2 types are more like text fields where volunteers are typing in a response. So there's 6 of these types of questions. And then there's selection list fields, which function more like drop-down menus. So if you do have more specific information that you're looking from your volunteers to receive, this is generally where that would be housed. Now, everything we're talking about at this point is your general application. So whenever someone creates a profile, it doesn't really matter what they're signing up for. They're going to be using your general application. There's one other form of asking questions in service, and that would be custom registration questions. If you're not familiar with these, or if you haven't used these yet, we have done webinars on this topic in the past. But these are an excellent way to look for very specific information when volunteers are registering for specific opportunities. So if you have, for example, an application process for an internship, and you need to ask for some information from those volunteers that you don't need most people to give you, maybe, for example, referral information or references, you could ask those questions as a part of the registration process or application process for that internship and not have those questions presented to every other volunteer in the system. So that's kind of another way to add in additional information. Now, this menu here to manage custom registration questions is where you create those questions, but where they're actually incorporated into your system is in the events themselves. When you are in the event database, if you go into search and manage existing opportunities, every opportunity in your database has the ability to add custom questions to it. So this is where you would select which questions are a part of this particular event. One kind of final major item regarding your application questions is the ability to reorder those options. So when you're looking at your application, if you don't like the way the information is presented, perhaps you've created a custom name field. Maybe you want to ask volunteers to provide their middle name or their preferred name or something like that. You could ask that question using a custom field, but that's not necessarily going to show up immediately next to the other name options. So what you can do is at the top of information collection, click on reorder volunteer profile fields. And in this menu, you can drag and drop these questions to change where they show up on the application itself. As a pretty simple example, Service does normally have last name at the top of the application. And if you don't like that, you can swap those just by dragging and dropping it. Now you'll see on this page all of the possible questions that could be on your application. So that would include things that are not currently being used, as well as items that are disabled, which means you're not using that information at all. It's not going to show up necessarily anywhere. But on the back end, you have the ability to control which of these fields are enabled. So you can also therefore control where they show up on the application, as well as where they show up when you are reviewing a volunteer profile. All right, 2 more pieces of information I want to kind of cover regarding application information. And one of those is your terms and conditions. Now, terms and conditions is a very generic phrase. It can refer to a lot of different things. But the idea behind terms and conditions is that you can collect a signature from a volunteer when they're creating a profile with you. So that signature can follow a couple different formats. If you've been with us for a while and you haven't looked at this field recently, we did add the options to require signatures as a part of this instead of just a checkbox only. But what that looks like on the application, let me pull up my demo console here. When a volunteer is looking at your terms, they'll see an intro text, which you can edit. They have to check the box. They'll see the terms themselves, which you write out. And these can, of course, represent a wide variety of things. And then they'll be asked to provide their signature. The end of the year is a good time to look into this again, make changes to this, update this, because then you can ask volunteers to basically re-sign this at the start of the new year. If you do have new terms, you just need to update the language a little bit. Service does keep track of volunteers' signatures of the terms, as well as which version of the terms they signed. So if you are in the system configuration and you edit your terms and conditions, well, that's a new version of your terms and conditions. And so when a volunteer goes to edit their profile, or we're going to look at in a moment, requiring people to update their account information, if they're looking at the terms, if they're editing their account, they'll have to sign the terms again if it's a new version. And when a volunteer does sign the terms, it shows up on their profile. So if we go into the volunteer database here, and we go to view a volunteer's profile, it's going to show us about partway through or about halfway through the accepted terms and conditions. This tells us the last date that the volunteer signed those terms, and the system stores up to 10 of these dates. So you can have multiple versions of those signed terms on a volunteer's account. And again, if they signed an outdated version of those terms, and then that volunteer goes to update their profile, if you have a new version or if it's been more than a year, they'll be asked to re-sign those terms. Okay, one last really important aspect of revising your volunteer application, kind of what information is being collected, is the ability to require verification of volunteer profile information, which is a lot of words to basically say that volunteers are required to look over their account and input new fields. So if you have new questions on their account, or on the application, they'd have to give you that information. Or maybe you made a profile for that volunteer in the past and they never actually logged in on their own. When they log in next, they'll be required to look over their profile information. So you can force that as kind of like a trigger when volunteers log into their account, basically by just going through the volunteer database. So from the main dashboard, go into Search and Manage Volunteer Database. Search for everyone in the system by leaving the search field blank and clicking Search Volunteer Database. You can select all the results with the checkbox in the heading. And then from here, you can do an update. So you can update all of these profiles at one time. Click the corresponding button. And then at the bottom of this section or this page, towards the bottom, you'll see require verification of volunteer profile information. And again, what this does, so if I select this to update it, change that to yes, what that will do is set a flag on every person's profile that the next time they log into their account, they will be required to look over their profile and make sure that everything is up to date. So that includes, again, any new fields you've set up on the application. If you've cleared out any fields, then they would have to be, they'd have to fill that in again. So they'd be asked to update data like that. And of course, that gives them the opportunity to change things too, like their address or their phone number, if any of that kind of information has changed. And then importantly, it also requires that volunteers re-sign your terms if your terms are new. So it's a new version of the terms, or at least new to them, or it's been more than a year since they last signed the terms. So this is something I recommend doing on an annual basis. If you do have volunteers in your system who year over year don't log in and update their account, you're not really doing anything negative by continuing to mark this on their profile. It's just a flag. You can basically consider it checked on their account. So the next time they log in, they'll have to do this. It doesn't matter if you reset that again. So you don't need to try to filter for people who aren't logging in. Okay, so that's kind of updating data collection and what's on the application, and also requiring that volunteers update their profiles. We're going to talk next about some database cleanup options in several parts of the database. So starting with volunteer management, if you would like to, you can mark volunteers as inactive. Now, you don't have to mark volunteers as inactive. You don't have to delete volunteer accounts. There's no cap on how many volunteers can be in your system. Those are all options if you need to take those. But for some organizations, they like to keep track of who is an active versus an inactive volunteer. And that obviously depends on what you define as an active versus inactive volunteer. But depending on what your definition of that is, there are ways to search for volunteers and then bulk mark them as inactive so that you can have kind of a representation of that and run searches, using that kind of information. So if you do want to mark inactive volunteers, a very common way to do so is based on, have they had any activity in the system? Or have they registered for an event in the last year or 18 months? That kind of information is searchable using the advanced volunteer search. So we can get there from this menu. We can also get there from the main dashboard, go into advanced volunteer search. And from this page, there's a couple sections I want to point out. Obviously, there's a lot of options on this page, but I want to talk about two sections in particular. Under service account status options, you have the ability to search for active versus inactive through here. So that's kind of what we're talking about. But then below that, you can also search for volunteers that have not had account activity for more than a certain number of months. This means they haven't logged into their account or signed up for anything within X number of months. This is a pretty good metric for identifying inactive volunteers. You can kind of just go through and say, I want to find people who haven't had any activity for more than 18 months. It's a pretty good way to do that. You can also search for volunteers based on when their account was created or entered into service. So this is the service start date, which you can technically edit that. So if you wanted to have that reflect when someone began working with you, if that was decades ago, that date can be reflected through here as well. And then another section I want to point out, if we scroll further down, is the participation options. In the volunteer participation options, you can search for volunteers that have more than, exactly, less than, or between a certain number of times served, or hours, or any of your impact tracking metrics between two dates. A really simple way to identify volunteers that haven't been engaging with you is to find volunteers with exactly 0 times served, and then whatever date range you're looking for. Now, typically, if I'm doing a search like this, I would also forecast this a little bit, so that I can exclude people that have activity upcoming. Maybe someone just made a profile this week and signed up for something next month. Well, if I search for activity, through today, it would, not include that person. So what I normally do when I'm running a search like this, let's say I want to find anybody who hasn't done anything for the last 18 months or for the last 12 months. Basically, what I would do is set my start date. So let's say I want to start in December of 2021. And then my end date, I would push out a couple months just to make sure I capture any people who might have signed up for something upcoming. Now, in your system what you have posted out. You might only have events posted out through the end of January, so then that's kind of all you would need to do for that kind of search. But running this again will basically show you any person with 0 registrations or 0 times served within this time frame. So that's kind of another good way to identify inactive volunteers, again, depending on what your definition is of an inactive volunteer. Now, once you run a search through here and you locate that set of individuals, you can use the same action we looked at earlier, a bulk update, to mark those people as inactive. So I could select multiple people here and then go into update, select the corresponding button, and then towards the bottom, there's a volunteer status field, which you can just basically use to mark volunteers as active versus inactive. I misspoke, that's actually kind of more towards the middle. But essentially in this page, you select, what things you want to bulk update, and you don't want to bulk update everything on a volunteer account. Something that you can do to kind of quickly find things on this page is use the find in browser if you need to. So you could search by the term status or different things like that. Okay, but volunteer status is what Service uses to identify active versus inactive. So you can basically select to update that information through here. All right, there's one other kind of aspect of the volunteer database that's really good to take a look at every once in a while, and I would just do that on an annual basis, and that is who has higher access to your system. It's a good idea to verify who in your database has admin access or leadership team access every once in a while, because it is a very high level of access, and you want to kind of control that list. We don't enforce any sort of limits on the number of admins you have in your system or the number of leadership teams, so you can create a lot of leadership team or admin, but it's a good idea to control that list because that is a very high level of access. So what you can do is in the advanced search, so same place we just were, under the service account status options, you can search for individuals with admin or leadership team, or potentially both of those, using Control or Shift to select more than one thing. And then you can essentially show who has higher than volunteer access or who has admin or leadership team access. And then if you need to go through and downgrade any accounts through here, you can update a profile and then down towards the bottom, mark that person as, a volunteer. And essentially what that will do is it will remove that person from that admin list, so they no longer have that level of access, but it doesn't touch any of their existing contacts or connections in the system. So you're not removing any legacy information. You are preventing further, disruption or edits from that individual. So that's a good thing to do every once in a while. As an aside, there is a quick report you can run to view all of the access levels. Under volunteer management and report management, you can run a report in here for permission levels. It's number 12 by default. It doesn't use a date range here. Click on Run Report. That'll just give you a Word document listing of everyone with higher than volunteer access. All right, the next part of the database we're going to take a look at is the group management side of things. And there's been a couple additions to that side in the last few months, last few years. So I want to make sure to point those out. Specifically with groups, you can add tags. So if you want to identify sets of groups, then that's a good way to do so. I could identify that a group is, a student group or a youth group, or that it's a school group or a corporate group or a church or something like that, using a tag. And then you can search for sets of groups, using those tags. The way you add a tag to a group is just by clicking to manage the group itself, and then click on the right-hand side, add group tag, and then just identify, what information you want to use there. So that is kind of more of a managerial aspect, but it is a good thing to do if you do have a lot of groups. It can help you kind of narrow down sets of groups if you want to run searches based on that data or reports on that information. And then one thing else you can do is you can run advanced searches for a set of groups. So using tags or using other information like have they had activity or when were they actually created. Using that kind of information as a search, you can run a search for a set of groups, and you can also mark them as inactive. So same as with volunteers, you can mark a group as inactive. So that would be sort of the same kind of concept. You're not removing it from the system, but what you are doing is marking them as inactive. And what that will do is prevent them from showing up in searches. So when you're searching for like a group to add to an event, inactive groups are going to be ignored automatically. I didn't mention this when we were in the volunteer database side, so I do want to mention it briefly. An inactive volunteer is still a volunteer in your database. You can still run reports on them. You can still search for them specifically, but they will not receive blast communication. So when you send an email to your entire volunteer database, inactive volunteers are ignored, kind of in the same vein as unsubscribed volunteers. Okay, so that's the group database. And then the last part of the database we want to go through is opportunity management. So there's a couple things to point out in your opportunities that are just a good thing to do every once in a while. One of those is checking who are the contacts. So kind of like we did with, verifying who's who are your admin in the system. You might want to run a check every once in a while to see who are the contacts for your different events. You can see that directly on this page if you mouse over this contact icon next to an event. It'll tell you who are the primary and secondary organizers for that particular event. So if you do have an individual who was working with you and recently left the organization, you can run a search for any events that have that person as an organizer if they still have higher access. So you could basically run a search for all the people or all the events associated with that individual. You can also do so within a date range. Typically, if I'm editing this kind of information, like someone left the organization, I would only do so for open events because I don't really need to edit my past events and kind of retcon that information. You can leave those events as is with the contact the way that it is. That's actually pretty useful legacy information because you can see kind of like who was in charge of that event initially or who was the contact initially. So I typically only edit this information moving forward. So like if this person, Bobby, had just left the organization, I would search for that person by name, search for events that are open, and then I could essentially just go through and bulk update these events to remove Bobby as one of the contacts. So same kind of actions as what we saw on the volunteer database side, but I can select those events here, go into the bulk actions, go into at the bottom, update opportunity attributes, select the corresponding button. And the only thing I'd want to change here is who are the contacts? Now, I would need to know first if he's the primary or the secondary organizer, but I can select both of those things if I want to edit them both, or just edit one or the other. Okay, so that's a good thing to do every once in a while. And then also a couple more things that are a little bit different. One is marking no-shows. So if it's not something that you're currently doing or not something that's currently in your workflow, it's good to be aware of this as a concept in service. When you are looking at the list of attendees for an event, there are a few different ways that you can remove people from that event if they didn't attend. So I could just select people through here and unregister them. That would remove them from the event. But you can also mark individuals as no-shows. That does two things. It removes someone from the event, and then it also adds a no-show note to their profile, which is something you can search for. You can find individuals based on how many no-shows they've had within a given time frame. So you can do that directly through the event itself, but you can also do this as a bulk action. If we go back to the main opportunity dashboard, I can select multiple events, and then in the drop-down menu, I can choose to mark no-shows. Now, this will not pull up every single person on the event. It's not going to also automatically mark no-shows. What it does is it pulls up a list of individuals who did not use the sign-in console for a shift that has already taken place. So I can see all the people who didn't sign in for something that has already occurred. And I can quickly go through this list and say, okay, actually remember that Alejandro was there. I can sign that person in to get them off of this list. And then I could select everyone else and mark them as no-shows. And again, in kind of one swoop, that will do two things: remove them from their shifts so they don't get credit, and then also add a no-show note to their profile, which again is something you can search by. So if you're not already using no-shows, that is a good tool to be aware of. That can help you identify individuals who haven't necessarily been as consistent. And again, you can see that data on their profile and run searches by that information. Okay, and the last thing to point out here as we're talking about your opportunity database is sometimes you might have kind of orphaned events like copies that you don't actually use or old versions of events that don't have any registrations, and it's safe to delete that kind of information. So for example, I have this event here in my system, which is a copy. There's no one registered for it. It has the word copy in the title. I can go in here to manage the opportunity, and down at the bottom, I can delete that. That would permanently remove it from the database. But since this is a copy and I didn't actually wind up using this, there's nobody signed up for it, there's no problem in doing that. The system will not let you delete an event if there are registrations associated with it. So for example, if I go into the original version of that event and I try to do the same thing, delete opportunity at the bottom, it will not let me do so because there are volunteers registered for the opportunity. You're not going to accidentally delete a lot of information that way. Obviously, if you're working on an event and you haven't yet posted it or no one signed up for it yet, you don't want to delete that kind of thing. But you can search for events with the word copy in the title if you do have any kind of lingering copies that you didn't utilize. You don't have to delete them. There's no cap to how many events can be in your system, but sometimes it's nice to get rid of that information that's not actually relevant or isn't actually going to be used at some point. All right. Well, the last topic that I want to go through today is just kind of the general look of your console. There's a lot of different options in Service to change the way that the system appears, both to your volunteers as well as to you on the admin side of the database. And then also you can change, what Service says in different places. So as volunteers are navigating the system, they can view different paragraphs and those can kind of direct volunteers in different ways. Pretty much all of those options are contained in the system configuration. So if we go back into the system configuration, there's two sections that I want to draw your attention to, and that's page content and system appearance. Email message content is kind of in the same vein, but these are obviously emails that are going out to volunteers as opposed to standalone pages. But the page content section will contain a lot of different welcome messages, which are effectively the intro paragraphs at the tops of different pages. And of course, you can change those whenever you'd like to. We did recently add the option to preview where these show up in the database. So if you're not totally sure what something represents, this preview icon on the right-hand side will help you identify where that shows up for volunteers. That's a really helpful tool, especially if you want to see what that kind of information looks like in situ. So I would always encourage you to take a look at these paragraphs, make sure that you're giving volunteers relevant information, directing them towards, the actions they need to take, or different information that you always want volunteers to be aware of on different pages. So that's the page content section. One thing I also want to point out, some of these contain the option to include variables. Not most of them, but for example, the volunteer portal homepage. At the top of the page when a volunteer is logged into their account, you could have it say, hello, Bruce, or whomever, by putting in this first name variable. So you can kind of make it a little bit more customized. And of course, you can change the fonts and all that sort of stuff through here. But those variables, wherever they are applicable, you will see that information posted in this information box here. And again, if you want to preview like where that is or what that looks like, you can use that preview icon to do so. Okay, so that's the page content section. Again, email message content is also kind of similar, but those are emails going out to volunteers. But the last section I want to point out is system appearance. So this contains a lot of different things like your logos and how those will show up to volunteers. If you want to change any of these, contact our customer support team, which you can do so by, at the bottom of the page, clicking on the Need Help button. But also in this section, you'll see your console header and your footer. These are at the top and bottom of the page on the standalone version of Service. So if you're not embedding Service into your website, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. We do have some articles about kind of best use cases and different ways to engage this information to make it customized to your website or to what you want volunteers to be able to do. But that's these headers and footers here. And then below that are all the colors in Service, the different button styles, shapes, input field shapes, whether or not there's shadows on different boxes, and then of course your system-wide font. We use Google Fonts for this library, so if you don't see a font you'd like to use in there and it is in that library, just submit a support request about it. Okay, and then the last kind of item in this vein is embedding service into your website. We have had separate conversations about this as well. We also offer a web integration meeting. So if you're interested in having kind of a more personalized conversation about what it looks like to embed service into your website, contact our support team to get the ball rolling with that. But essentially, what you can do with service is you can embed it directly into your website and make it look something more like this, where this is our standalone website where I have the event listing page embedded directly. And that way I'm not actually sending people over to, a standalone page. I'm actually having people go to our website, to sign up for an event, and they can kind of take all their actions, directly within that. This is an excellent way to kind of engage your volunteers and make sure that service, fits into your needs by not sending people away to a separate page, but actually keeping them on your website. Like I said, we can have a separate conversation about what this looks like, kind of how to engage this topic. There's a lot of different ways you can embed service and different pages you can embed, depending on kind of what your needs are. But yeah, this is something we can have a more specific conversation about as you need. All right, so a couple things I want to just end with here, and then we'll move into Q&A next. As always, whenever you are in your system, if you have questions or if you need assistance, you can always click on the Need Help button at the bottom of the page. This is how you contact our support team. You can type in a topic through here. So let's say you want to learn more about web integration. You could search for that term. There's articles on that topic. You could also search for different topics that we talked about today, like that verification option or different things like that. So there's a lot of information in here. But also you can click on the Contact Us button to contact our customer support team and engage them with your questions directly. They are very responsive and very friendly. So please feel free to use this whenever you need to. So we're going to move into Q&A next. We'll be taking questions that have come in from the entire group. And, as you still have questions, please feel free to continue writing those in. But we're just going to jump right into that. So a question came up of where the bulk update option is after you search for a set of volunteers. So we talked about like bulk updating volunteers to mark them as inactive, or using the bulk update tool to do require verification of volunteer profile information. So again, where that tool is found is after you have run a search, whether that's through the standard Search Manage Volunteer Database or using the advanced search tool once you've run a search. From here, you can select your results using the checkbox in the heading. And then above that, you have this drop-down menu, which is all of your bulk actions. And of course, one of those actions is to update selected volunteer profiles, which is the bulk update action. On the right, the button will have the same name. Click on that button. And then from here, you pick which things you want to bulk update. So we talked about two things today: volunteer status, which is the active versus inactive dichotomy. And then at the bottom, we also talked about require verification of volunteer profile information. So that's where those two things are found. And of course, you can bulk update other information. One thing I neglected to mention earlier about custom fields is if you want to kind of repurpose a custom field, you can actually clear all of the previous contents of that. Or maybe you have a custom field that you use to gather information from volunteers that you want to kind of redo every year, kind of clear it out and then ask people. An example I can think of is asking people what their first, second, third preferences are, something like that for a particular type of job or role. You could use a custom field like that and clear it out basically every year before asking people to update their account information. All right, excellent question. So yeah, that was basically just going back into the bulk update actions from the volunteer database side. Okay, another question came in about engaging volunteers in groups. Basically, how do you add someone to a group? And can you add someone to multiple groups? And that's a good question. The answer is yes. Groups are an attribute on volunteer profiles. And a volunteer can be a member of as many groups as you need them to be, because they're not exclusive. So basically, on a volunteer's profile, if you go into manage someone's account, you can view or update what groups they are a member of. So you can do that directly through the volunteer's profile. Click on view or update, go through here and select which groups you want to add them to. and then add those to their profile. Again, you can add as many as you want to each volunteer's profile because they are an attribute. You can also take a similar action through the group database side. So we did this through a specific volunteer's profile. We could also do this in bulk for multiple volunteers. I could do the same bulk action that we looked at earlier, updating volunteer accounts and adding people to a group. You can do volunteer group membership add and remove. And then you can also take that same kind of action through the group itself. So in attribute management, if you go into group management, you can click to basically view all the members of a group. If you go into manage a group, you can view or update the volunteers assigned to the group. And from here, you can look someone up by name to add them to this group. And then, of course, you can also see who's in this list and remove people if you need to. Okay, good question. That was about basically just engaging, who is a member of what group and how to update that information. All right. Well, that looks like that was kind of all the questions that would be good for the entire group. Obviously, if you do have more specific questions about your database, feel free to continue writing those in, but you can also contact our customer support team. I do also want to mention that all of our past recorded webinars, I know I mentioned one today about custom registrations, you can find those on our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com, you can see that listing there, or just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies. But yeah, all of that is available as a resource, and that is an excellent tool for kind of reviewing different parts of the system. Especially in the last few years, we've added quite a few new kind of topics or new ideas and features, and we usually do a webinar on each of those topics as those get added. So thank you again for your time today. It's always great to see you all in the chat, especially those that I've met with recently even. So thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure to work with all of you, and we're all as a team grateful for the work that you do throughout all the different organizations and communities that you're impacting. Partnering with you is really one of the most satisfying aspects of our work. So if you have any questions from our content today or regarding refreshing your database for the new year or any of the topics that we discussed, again, feel free to contact our customer support team or email support@servicetech.com. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your week.